Good afternoon. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center for Security Policy. We are delighted to be sponsoring on short notice, but I think very timely, topical presentation by several of the people who I think are most knowledgeable about and certainly most effective in communicating about the threat that is known as electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. The various ways in which that pulse could afflict a nation like the United States, either man-caused or naturally occurring, and the repercussions of such an affliction. We're going to talk a bit about a very important and somewhat unexpected, but not unanticipated, development in the past few days that bears directly upon the man-caused piece of the problem, namely the interception in Panama of a vessel of North Korean operation that had in its hold some weaponry that might bear directly upon the threat of man-caused nuclear EMP. We'll be going through a sequence of presentations that will touch on that and the naturally occurring phenomenon. We'll also talk about how we can take steps, indeed how we believe we must take steps as quickly as possible to mitigate America's vulnerability, specifically the vulnerability of our electrical grid, upon which our entire society, of course, critically depends, to this phenomenon of electromagnetic pulse, however it is generated. I'm going to move through this batting order fairly quickly. It is a star-studded cast. We'll talk at the end a bit about what specifically is now in play on Capitol Hill as a remedy to this problem. We'll also talk about public opinion attitudes on the danger posed by EMP and the necessity of mitigating our vulnerability to it. And then finally, we'll announce the formation of a new coalition to try to help ensure that these corrective actions are taken as a matter of urgency, as we believe is appropriate. We're going to be hearing first from Dr. Peter Pry. Dr. Pry has history of deep knowledge on matters involving nuclear and EMP-related threats. He served, among other things, as the executive director of the EMP Threat Commission, a blue ribbon, congressionally mandated study that over a number of years conclusively established the nature of the threat. He is currently the executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, and also a director of the United States Nuclear Strategy Forum, and of considerable expertise, in part derived from his years in the intelligence community in the United States, as well as a professional staff member on Capitol Hill. I'm very pleased to have him here to address specifically this question of what the North Korean vessel had aboard it and what it might portend. With that, Peter Pry, over to you.
Thank you so much, Frank. One of the nightmare scenarios the Congressional EMP Commission had was the possibility of a rogue state or terrorist group, and they specifically considered both Iran and North Korea when examining this threat, making an EMP attack against the United States by launching a primitive missile off of a freighter near the U.S. coast. What is an electromagnetic pulse? In EMP, think of it as super lightning, except its effects, instead of being on an area, on a point, can be in an area. When you detonate a nuclear weapon at high altitude, at 30 kilometers or more, it generates a super energetic radio wave that will destroy electronics potentially across a continental-sized area if the altitude is high enough. But even at the relatively lower altitudes, it basically cause massive destruction of the electric grid and all the critical infrastructures that depend upon that. The communications, transportation, food, and water, the things that sustain our modern civilization and life itself, would collapse in the aftermath of an EMP nuclear attack. This can also be caused by the sun, by a solar flare that can generate something very similar to a nuclear EMP. Now, why are we here today? Because of our particular concerns about the North Korean freighter that was intercepted in Panama, the Chong Gang. You know, this North Korean flagged freighter with a North Korean crew, which resisted the boarding of it by the Panamanian authorities, and the captain attempted suicide rather than being boarded on preliminary examination, and the whole vessel hasn't been examined yet. They've only examined one cargo hold, 20%, and have already found 2 SA-2 missiles. These are admittedly old surface-to-air missiles, but they were designed to carry both conventional and nuclear warheads. They also are high-altitude missiles. They were used back in the 60s to take down Gary Francis Powers during the U-2 incident. They can reach an altitude of 20 to 35 kilometers, so they can reach the altitude for an EMP attack. They've got a slant range of about 40 miles, which means you could take a missile like this, put it in a freighter, stand off the coast, outside of our international territorial waters, and put an EMP attack over some place like New York City or Baltimore. The area of effect would reach 60 miles inland and probably collapse the Eastern Electric Grid, which generates 70% of the electric power of the United States, which would have catastrophic consequences. The Congressional EMP Commission estimated that an attack like this, given our current state of unpreparedness, could kill up to 90% of the American population within a year from starvation, disease, and societal collapse. It's basically a high-tech means of killing people the old-fashioned way. Now, none of us are alleging that the purpose of the North Korean freighter was to do an EMP attack, or even that they were practicing this. In fact, they probably weren't. But it's extremely disturbing to find that we didn't even know that a freighter of a rogue state like North Korea actually had nuclear-capable missiles in it, 2 of them, and there were other dismantled parts within that hold, and we didn't even know about it. The Panamanians didn't stop them because they had direct knowledge of these missiles. They stopped them because the Chong Gang had a history of carrying drugs and arms to criminal organizations, and they apparently thought that they were going to find drugs aboard. Instead, they found, in effect, what could be a delivery system for a weapon of mass destruction. So it should give us pause that we have this sort of activity going on in our backyard, the Caribbean. These visits by North Korea and by Iranian freighters to countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba happen all the time, and we don't know what's going on. So it makes much more plausible the nightmare scenario that the EMP Commission raised, which is this idea of a foreign flagged vessel, a freighter, rogue states or terrorists conducting a nuclear EMP attack that would have catastrophic consequences for the United States. I mean, everything was there except the nuclear weapons on the missile. Another thing I want to point out is, I'm amazed at how little reported this incident has been in the press. In fact, I only learned about it myself this morning. But on April 16th, an armed gang attacked a farm of transformers in San Jose, California with AK-47s and tried to take them out. They damaged 5 of the transformers. This made the local press. Didn't make much of the national news, didn't make any as far as I could tell. And initially the local sheriff reported it as a sabotage attempt against these transformers. Subsequently the reporting has toned it down that it was vandalism with AK-47s. None of the transformers were destroyed, but 5 of them were damaged. And this alone was sufficient to cause them to put people to call for reduced electrical use in the San Jose area because of the damaged transformers. Now, if you put this together with what's been happening to our country, massive cyber attacks against our computer systems. Now you've got an armed gang, of some sort that made this attempt against these transformers, a physical sabotage attempt, and now a freighter carrying nuclear-capable missiles off of our coasts. One of the things the Commission found that's very important and that hasn't been widely understood by people, but people like R. James Woolsey in congressional testimony have been trying to educate policymakers to this fact, is that cyber warfare in the doctrines of countries like Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran is not just about computer viruses. Their doctrine includes physical attacks like sabotage attempts against transformers and critical parts, and all the way up to nuclear EMP attack. That is considered part of cyber warfare doctrine by these guys. I would like to see the press, instead of maybe cooperating with an administration that seems to think the war on terrorism is over, to ask, what is there some larger significance to all of these seemingly unconnected events? These massive cyber attacks, this recent attempt at sabotage, the discovery of this freighter with these missiles. Is it possible that dry runs are being made for a larger operation, for an all-out cyber offensive that would include all of these elements? Computer viruses, sabotage against freighters, finally, an EMP nuclear attack? We see these things happening all around us, and yet nobody's asking Jay Carney, what does the president think about the significance of these missiles in this freighter, or this attempt on these transformers in California? A recent Lloyd's of London study, not looking at nuclear EMP attack, just looking at geographic storms, estimated that if only 10 to 20 transformers were destroyed in the Baltimore-Washington area, 10 to 20 transformers, it would put 40 to 80 million Americans in blackout, possibly for 2 years. For 2 years, just from the loss of 10 to 20 transformers. These guys with AK-47s tried to attack 10 transformers. I think we've got some questions here for Janet Napolitano and others in the Department of Homeland Security about what are they going to do to protect the transformers. I've probably taken up more of my time. I'll leave others to talk about what to do about it.
It's very important groundwork, though, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank.
To talk a little bit more about the specific threat that Peter has described and that the EMP Commission considered sufficiently serious to recommend be addressed as a matter of utmost importance to the nation. From the South, we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Hank Cooper. Professor Cooper, among many other distinguished roles in our country's government, served as the director of the Strategic Defense Initiative under President George Herbert, which knows a lot about both missile threats and the state of our abilities to discern them and correct them. Is, as they say, a rocket scientist. Very pleased to have you.
Thanks, Frank. I want to add just a point or two to what Peter said. Lloyd's of London also, in reports I saw, indicated that this particular vessel earlier this year had made stops in Russia and in China. And in my mind, the whole incident points to what I refer to as a cacophony of proliferation. And while we focus on North Korea and Iran are colleagues cooperating on nuclear testing and on ballistic missiles, and they both launch satellites, have launched in the past year, satellites over the South Pole, which, if they were carrying a nuclear weapon, were at just about the right altitude to be detonated over the center of the United States and potentially knock out the entire electric grid. So in the case of North Korea, perhaps our historic approach to things might deter them. Some might argue that. But in the case of Iran, we know they're ideologically committed to not only the destruction of Israel, the little Satan, but also the United States, the great Satan. And there's serious question as to whether or not the leaders of Iran would back away, and I'm assuming others will talk more about Iran on the basis of being concerned about nuclear retaliation if they could kill, hundreds of millions of Americans, which is what is at stake with this EMP threat. Now, in the case of the threat from the South, there are two kinds of threats that I want to talk briefly about. You mentioned the EMP Commission. Even earlier than that, there was a threat commission that Don Rumsfeld chaired in the late 90s, which noted that threat missiles could be launched off of our coast. And it could be launched over the United States, and we had no defense about it. I don't know why Don didn't do anything about this during his term as the Secretary of Defense, but he didn't. We're just as vulnerable today as we were in the late 90s and during the time